November 18, 1952. 27,000 feet above the frozen sea of Japan, Lieutenant Elmer Royce Williams sat alone in his F9F Panther, flying combat air patrol near the Soviet border. The radio crackled with routine chatter. His wingmen were spread across the gray sky, watching for trouble. None of them knew they were about to stumble into a secret that would be buried for 50 years. Williams checked his fuel gauge, scanned the horizon, and that's when he saw them. 7 silver shapes diving out of the clouds. 7 Soviet MiG-15 bis fighters, the most advanced interceptors on the planet, flown by pilots who weren't supposed to be there. The Cold War was about to turn hot at 27,000 feet, and the only witness would be a farm kid from South Dakota flying a Navy jet that everyone said couldn't compete with a MiG. What happened in the next 35 minutes will become the longest dogfight in United States naval aviation history. Williams would down at least 4 enemy aircraft, possibly more. His Panther would absorb 263 bullet holes. He would nurse a crippled jet back to his carrier in a storm, landing at speeds that should have killed him. And then the United States government would classify the entire incident, lock it away, forbid him from ever speaking about it, because admitting that American and Soviet pilots had just killed each other over international waters might trigger World War III. The American public wouldn't learn the truth until 2002, when the records were finally declassified. By then, Williams was 77 years old. The Navy upgraded his Silver Star to the Navy Cross. Some say he deserved the Medal of Honor. But before we talk about awards, before we talk about recognition, we need to talk about what really happened that day when one American pilot found himself alone against 7 of the Soviet Union's best. The F9F Panther wasn't supposed to be in this fight. It was subsonic. The MiG-15 could break the sound barrier in a dive. The Panther was designed for ground attack and fleet defense, not high-altitude knife fights with swept-wing interceptors that climbed faster, turned tighter, and carried bigger guns. On paper, this was a mismatch. Soviet pilots had been training specifically to counter American jets. They had real combat experience from World War II. Many of them were aces. The MiG-15 had already proven itself over Korea, outclassing early American jets and forcing the United States to rush the F-86 Sabre into combat. The Soviets knew their aircraft was superior. They knew their tactics were sound, and they absolutely knew that a single F9F Panther, caught alone, was dead meat. Williams didn't have time to think about any of that. The MiGs came in fast, dropping from altitude in a classic Soviet bounce maneuver. His wingmen were too far away to help. The rest of his flight was scattered across 50 miles of empty sky. Radio calls went out, but by the time anyone could respond, this fight would be over. Williams did the only thing he could do. He turned into them. Not away, searching for escape. Into them, accepting the fight, trusting his training and his aircraft. The Panther might have been slower, but it was stable. It was predictable. And most importantly, it had 4 20mm cannons that didn't care about speed records when the trigger was pulled at 300 yards. The first MiG opened fire too early, spraying rounds past Williams's canopy. He waited, let the distance close, and squeezed his own trigger. 20mm shells ripped into the Soviet fighter's wing root. Pieces flew off. The MiG rolled inverted and dove away, trailing smoke. 6 more to go. The other MiGs split, trying to bracket him, force him to choose which threat to face. Williams kept turning, forcing them to commit, making them honor his nose every time it swung toward one of them. Soviet pilots were good, but they were also predictable. They'd been trained to operate as a unit, to overwhelm targets with numbers and coordinated attacks. Williams had been trained to survive alone. Every American carrier pilot knew that someday, somehow, you might end up separated from your flight with hostiles inbound and nobody coming to help. You either figured it out or you died. The second MiG came in from above, trying to use its energy advantage to slash through and escape before Williams could react. But Williams had already seen the setup. He pulled hard into the attack, forcing the Soviet pilot to either commit to a turning fight or abandon his run. The MiG pilot committed. Big mistake. The Panther might not climb like a MiG, but it turned predictably, and Williams knew exactly how much his aircraft could give him. He pulled lead, tracked the target through his gun sight, and fired. The MiG's fuselage erupted in flashes. The canopy shattered. The aircraft snap-rolled and fell away out of control. 2 down, 5 to go, and Williams was just getting started. The remaining MiGs changed tactics. They stopped trying to joust and started working as a team, setting up cross turns and trying to force Williams into a defensive spiral where they could bleed his energy and pick him apart. Soviet doctrine emphasized patience. We're down the target. Wait for mistakes. The problem was Williams wasn't making mistakes. Every time a MiG lined up for a shot, he was already turning, forcing them to lead more, to guess, to fire from angles that wasted ammunition. His fuel was dropping. His ammunition counters were spinning down. But so were theirs. And the longer this fight went on, the more the Soviet pilots realized they weren't fighting some terrified kid in an outclassed jet. They were fighting someone who'd already decided he was going home, no matter how many of them he had to shoot down to do it. The third kill came almost 15 minutes into the fight. Williams had been rationing his ammunition, firing short bursts, making every shell count. A MiG made a high-side pass and misjudged the closure rate. Williams pulled into him, calculated the deflection angle, and fired a 2-second burst. The shells walked right up the MiG spine. The tail section separated. The pilot ejected, his parachute blossoming white against the gray clouds. 3 down, 4 to go. But something had changed. The MiGs were no longer pressing attacks. They were hanging back, circling, looking for an opening that didn't exist. Williams could feel in his gut. They were scared. 7 of the Soviet Union's best had jumped a single American jet, and now 3 of them were dead or swimming in the Sea of Japan. The survivors weren't thinking about victory anymore. They were thinking about survival. Then it got worse. One of the remaining MiGs got lucky. Williams was tracking a target when another Soviet fighter opened up from the side, a deflection shot at maximum range. Most of the shells missed. But several 23mm rounds punched through the Panther's fuselage, tearing through hydraulic lines, ripping into control surfaces, puncturing fuel tanks. The jet shuddered. Warning lights flashed across the instrument panel. Williams felt the stick go mushy as hydraulic pressure dropped. His airspeed was bleeding off. The engine temperature was climbing. He was hurt, and the MiGs knew it. They pressed in, sensing blood, ready to finish this. Williams did something the Soviet pilots never expected. He turned into them again. Not away, not defensive. Aggressive. He lit his afterburner, the last desperate burst of speed his damaged jet could give him, and charged straight at the nearest MiG. The Soviet pilot flinched, broke off his attack, and that half-second of hesitation was all Williams needed. He fired. The MiG's engine exploded. The aircraft disintegrated in a ball of fire and debris. 4 down, 3 to go, and those last 3 MiGs wanted nothing more to do with this fight. They broke contact, climbing hard for Soviet airspace, leaving their dead behind. The dogfight was over. 35 minutes for confirmed kills. Possibly more, because Soviet records from that day are still classified. Williams was alone again, 27,000 feet above the Sea of Japan, in a jet that was barely flying. Now came the hard part, getting home. His carrier, the USS Oriskany, was 70 miles away. His fuel gauge was dropping toward zero. His hydraulics were shot. His radio was damaged, transmissions garbled and intermittent. Storm clouds were rolling in, visibility dropping to nothing. Williams nursed the Panther south, coaxing every mile out of his dying aircraft. The engine temperature kept climbing. Oil pressure kept falling. Every warning light on the panel was lit. The jet was telling him to eject, to abandon ship, to take his chances in the frozen water, and hope rescue would find him before hypothermia did. Williams ignored every warning. He'd survived 7 MiGs. He wasn't about to let a broken airplane kill him. He found the carrier in a rainstorm, the deck pitching in heavy seas. Normal landing speed for an F9F was about 120 knots. Williams was coming in at over 170 because his damage controls couldn't bleed off speed properly. Too fast, too heavy, and if he missed the arresting wires, he'd go straight into the ocean or crash into the planes parked on the bow. The landing signal officer saw him coming in hot and waved him off. Abort the landing, go around, and try again. Williams ignored him. He had maybe 90 seconds of fuel left. There was no go around. This was it. He slammed onto the deck. His tailhook caught the number 3 wire, and the Panther jerked to a stop with maybe 20 feet of deck to spare. The aircraft was so shot up that maintenance crews counted 263 holes in the fuselage. 263. The engine had been seconds from catastrophic failure. The hydraulics had been running on fumes. By every engineering calculation, that jet should have fallen out of the sky 10 minutes earlier. Williams climbed out of the cockpit, and that's when things got strange. Within minutes, intelligence officers swarmed the flight deck. They photographed the damage, collected shell fragments, interviewed Williams in private. Then they told him to forget everything that just happened. Forget the MiGs. Forget the dogfight. Forget the kills. This incident was now classified at the highest levels. If Williams talked about it, if he told anyone what happened, he would face court-martial and imprisonment. The United States and the Soviet Union were not officially at war. American and Soviet pilots were not supposed to be killing each other. If the public found out that Navy fighters and Soviet interceptors had just fought a running gun battle over international waters, it could trigger an escalation neither government wanted. So the Navy buried it. They gave Williams a Silver Star with a vague citation about extraordinary heroism. They sealed all records. They threatened everyone who knew about the fight with prosecution if they said a word. For 50 years, Royce Williams kept his mouth shut. He told his family he'd been in a fight, but not the details. He told fellow pilots he'd seen some action, but nothing specific. He carried the weight of that secret through the rest of his naval career, through retirement, through decades of watching documentaries about Korea that never mentioned his name. He watched other pilots get credit for dogfights that lasted 5 minutes. He watched the Navy celebrate air combat victories that paled in comparison to what he'd done. And he said nothing because he'd been ordered to say nothing, and Royce Williams was the kind of man who followed orders, even when those orders cost him the recognition he deserved. The truth finally came out in 2002 when Russian records were declassified and researchers noticed something odd. Soviet reports from November 18, 1952, mentioned losing multiple aircraft in combat with American fighters near the Soviet border. Details were sparse, but enough information leaked through to confirm what Williams had known for half a century. The dogfight was real. The kills were real. And the United States government had buried one of the most extraordinary acts of aerial combat in military history because admitting it happened was politically inconvenient. Williams was 77 years old when the story broke. The Navy quietly upgraded his Silver Star to the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor. Some congressmen pushed for the Medal of Honor. The Pentagon resisted, citing lack of documentation, even though the documentation existed and had been classified for political reasons. Think about what that means. A naval aviator faced 7 enemy fighters alone, shot down at least 4 of them, possibly more, survived catastrophic damage to his aircraft, and landed on a carrier in a storm with no fuel and minimal control. He did everything right. He fought smarter, flew better, and beat odds that should have killed him 10 times over. And his reward was 50 years of silence, a ribbon with a vague citation, and orders to never speak about the greatest accomplishment of his military career. Not because he did anything wrong, not because the mission failed, but because the United States government decided that admitting American and Soviet pilots were killing each other might make the Cold War less cold. So they buried him. They buried his wingmen who witnessed parts of the fight. They buried the maintenance crews who counted the bullet holes. They buried everyone connected to that mission and threatened them with prison if they ever told the truth. Williams never complained. He never demanded recognition. He never went to the press or wrote a book or sued the government for denying him the honors he earned. He just went on with his life, flew more missions, served his country, and retired with quiet dignity. When reporters finally tracked him down after declassification, he was matter-of-fact about the whole thing. "Yeah, it happened. Yeah, I shot down some MiGs. Yeah, the government told me to keep quiet. No, I'm not angry. That's just how it was back then." The humility was almost painful to watch. Here was a man who'd accomplished something extraordinary, been silenced for half a century, and his only response was a shrug and a comment about doing his duty. That's the kind of man who flew combat missions in the 1950s. They didn't do it for glory or recognition. They did it because it needed doing. But let's talk about what that fight really proves. 7 MiG-15s against 1 F9F Panther shouldn't have been a contest. The MiG was faster, climbed better, turned tighter, and carried heavier armament. Soviet pilots were experienced, well-trained, and aggressive. They had every advantage except one. They weren't fighting an airplane. They were fighting an American pilot who'd been taught that survival isn't about having the best equipment. Survival is about refusing to quit when quitting makes sense. Williams didn't have the faster jet. He had something better. He had training that emphasized individual initiative, tactics that rewarded aggression, and a culture that told him the aircraft doesn't determine the outcome of the fight. The pilot does. Soviet doctrine in 1952 was all about coordinated attacks, overwhelming firepower, and using superior numbers to guarantee victory. It worked against most opponents. It had worked in World War II. It was working in Korea, but it fell apart when they encountered someone who wouldn't play by their rules. Williams didn't try to run. He didn't try to evade. He turned into every attack, forced them to fight his fight, and made them pay for every mistake. Soviet pilots were trained to follow doctrine. American pilots were trained to adapt. When a situation changed, when the plan fell apart, when everything went sideways, American pilots were taught to figure it out and keep fighting. That's what Williams did. He figured it out. And 7 MiGs learned the hard way that numbers don't matter when the other guy refuses to lose. The F9F Panther proved something that day. It proved that American engineering wasn't just about building the fastest or the strongest. It was about building aircraft that brought pilots home. The Panther took 263 hits and kept flying. The engine kept running. The controls kept responding. The fuselage held together. When Williams trapped on that carrier deck, the aircraft had given him everything it had and then some. That's American design philosophy in a nutshell. Build it tough. Build it reliable. Build it so the pilot has a fighting chance even when everything goes wrong. Soviet jets were fast and deadly, but they were also temperamental, maintenance-intensive, and unforgiving of damage. The MiG-15 was a scalpel. The F9F Panther was a hammer. And sometimes, when you're alone at 27,000 feet with 7 hostiles inbound, you don't need precision. You need something that refuses to break. Royce Williams turned 100 years old in 2023. He lived long enough to see his story finally recognized, long enough to receive the Navy Cross, long enough to watch documentaries and history books correct the record and put his name where it belonged. He lived long enough to hear from other pilots who've been inspired by what he did. He lived long enough to know that the 50 years of silence didn't erase what happened. The truth came out. It always does. Williams passed away in June 2024 at the age of 100. The Navy sent honor guards. Fellow pilots attended the funeral. Headlines called him a hero, but the people who knew him best said he never thought of himself that way. He thought of himself as a guy who had a job to do, did it to the best of his ability, and went home when it was over. That's it. No drama, no self-aggrandizement, just duty. The real vindication came from an unexpected source. In 2007, a Russian researcher published declassified Soviet records that confirmed Williams had shot down 4 MiGs, possibly 5. Soviet pilots who survived the engagement reported that they'd never encountered an American pilot with that level of skill. One Soviet report described Williams as demonstrating exceptional tactical awareness and marksmanship that exceeded anything their intelligence had suggested American naval aviators were capable of. In other words, they thought they were jumping easy prey. They found out they'd stumbled into a buzzsaw. Soviet command was so rattled by the incident that they issued new directives about engaging American aircraft near the border, emphasizing caution and numerical superiority. They learned the lesson Williams taught them. Don't assume the aircraft tells the whole story. Perhaps the ultimate validation of what Williams accomplished that day comes from looking at the statistics. 35 minutes of continuous combat. For confirmed kills, 263 bullet holes absorbed. Emergency landing in a storm with no fuel and minimal control. 50 years of enforced silence. And through it all, Williams never once claimed he was special or extraordinary. He just said he did what anyone in his position would have done. But that's not true. Most pilots in his position would have died in the first 2 minutes. Most pilots would have tried to run, been overtaken, and been shot down. Most pilots would have ejected when the warning lights started flashing and the hydraulics failed. Williams didn't. He fought smarter, flew better, and brought himself and his aircraft home against impossible odds. That's not what anyone would have done. That's what one man did on one day in a war that officially never happened. The sky belonged to America that day, not because we had the best jet or the most advanced technology. The sky belonged to America because we had Royce Williams, and 7 Soviet pilots learned the hard way that superiority isn't measured in speed or firepower. Superiority is measured in the moment when everything goes wrong and you keep fighting anyway. That's the lesson of November 18th, 1952. That's the legacy of the F9F Panther. And that's why, 50 years later, the truth finally came out and a farm kid from South Dakota got the recognition he earned in 35 minutes of hell over the frozen sea of Japan.